morning. Okay, good morning, everyone. Good morning. Good to see you all again. Start with a prayer. In the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Lord God, be with us today. We thank you for your presence already. We thank you for your mind, and we thank you for making yourself known to us, both in our reason and through your revelation, through Jesus Christ. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, is now, and will be forever. Amen. In the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Blessed Fulton Sheen, pray for us. Okay, good to see you all again. So today we'll be going over the negative, the inverse, bad ideas. And so with that, we'll mostly be going over atheism and the two best arguments for atheism, both according to my generation, Gen Z, and Thomas Aquinas, the angelic doctor. So this dates back quite a bit. And, before you say, well, shouldn't we focus on protesting bad events or bad things? Yes, that's the answer to that. We should also do that. But a lot of the evil that we see today, it has its origin in ideas, right? In bad methods of thinking, in ignorance, and in sinful thoughts as well. And so if we start there, we cut off the evil tree by its roots before the fruit can sprout. It's been said before that ideas have consequences, right? If you sow an idea, you reap an action. If you sow an action, you reap a habit. And if you sow a habit, you reap a character. And if you sow a character, you reap a destiny. So this all relates to individual salvation, and it relates also to our culture as a whole, right? Which certainly has problems, and those problems can be remedied, and it starts with right thinking. Okay, so I looked this up. 2 of the 3 biggest reasons why non-Christians have a lack of faith in my generation, Gen Z, so the people born between 1999 and 2015, is the problem of evil, which we'll go over a lot more in a second, and science apparently refuting the Bible. We can just take that to be science refuting religion. And the other reason was Christians are hypocrites, which, you're looking at one of them. And that happens a lot. But it doesn't prove anything because Jews are hypocrites, Muslims are hypocrites, even atheists who claim to be morally upright are hypocrites. So that doesn't prove one religion or another. So that's not really an argument. That's more of a personal problem. So we'll talk about the two of the 3 biggest actual arguments, which is the problem of evil and apparently science explaining everything. Okay, so going back to Aquinas. So when Aquinas in his Summa tries to argue for a position that actually isn't his, he'll typically give 3 reasons. And on this one issue of does God exist, he only gives 2, surprisingly. And this is the biggest issue there is at the heart of it. If there is no God, then Aquinas was wasting a lot of time out there in his monastery. But for this, he only gives 2. And those are the 2 reasons that have stuck around today: science and the problem of evil. And before I get into it, I just want to preface that me as a philosopher and a Christian philosopher, I can give some clues, right, some fingerprints on God's presence and God's goodness still in the face of so much evil in the world. But the Catholic Church says that only Christian faith as a whole provides the answer to this question. And I believe that too. So I can't give you, obviously, everything today about Revelation. Most of you probably know more of that than me, living your Christian lives in personal relationship with Jesus Christ. So that is the more definitive answer. Everything you've been given as a Catholic, that's the more definitive answer. But I can approach it as a philosopher and give sort of hints, right? And so that's what I'll be doing today. So just to define our parameters of what I'm trying to do here. Okay, great. So for the first one, we're going to start with the problem of evil, okay? And like any good philosopher, I'll try to define my terms or give a definition. So the argument typically goes something like this. If there is a God who's all good and all powerful, we would expect to see much more good or much less evil or no evil in the world today. But we see a lot of evil. Therefore, there is no God. So the argument goes, right? So first of all, and this is a little bit trite, and I don't think answers it in full at all, but there's a logical problem in the problem of evil for the atheist, which is that if you don't believe in God, that usually entails, and I think logically entails, a kind of materialism. You could say the mind kind of derives from the brain, kind of like a droplet of sweat coming down from your head. But ultimately, for the atheist, materialism is the most logical position. So if you're a materialist, well, this life form changing shape or structure into that life form doesn't really matter. Subjectively and emotionally, it could matter for that person or their loved ones, but objectively, above what is just felt on the inside, there's no basis for saying it's better for that being to look that way or to still have that kind of DNA working within it versus it being some other life form or fuel for some cow or for the plants in the ground, right? There's no reason to say why it's better one way or the other, objectively. So there's a logical problem in the problem of evil. And that's important to know. Okay. So again, this is not where I'm going to leave it, right? I found the problem, therefore you guys can just go home. But a lot of it is because we feel and live in the problem of evil, right? Every day. We don't live in heaven. We need to know these intellectual solutions, but also experience them too. And it's also the greatest temptation to doubt. And C.S. Lewis, when he was an atheist, we talked about C.S. Lewis a little bit during the seminar, he said he disbelieved in God, he didn't believe God existed, but he was also angry at God for not existing. And he was also angry at God for creating the universe, even though he didn't believe in God. So this is more like when you're talking to an atheist that is hung up on the problem of evil, it's more like you're talking to a divorcee than a scientific skeptic, right? Okay. And then another preface before you think I'm talking down to you or something. I'm not particularly good at dealing with the problem of evil personally, right? I'm definitely not perfect. And what I say is less helpful than living in relationship, right? So relationship with other people, your family members, your friends, and relationship with God, right? Living out your life with Jesus. So as an analogy, let's say that you're getting a root canal, something at the dentist, and you're holding on to your friend's hand as they kind of like support you in this endeavor. Well, that's a lot more helpful than remembering what Max said however many months ago at SJPII. But I think it is helpful for remembering why, when those thoughts trickle in of doubt, of why you're here in the first place, intellectually, why it makes sense rationally, why you're getting that root canal done, right? But it's still more helpful to have that hand to hold, to have that person to talk to have that God to trust, right? Okay. So I'm going to offer a positive understanding of evil. So evil is not a thing or an entity. but it's also not an illusion, right? It's real. It's not just a fake thing like Hindus say. Rather, I would say that it's a lack of being or a privation. Okay. Now, I'll give you examples as to why I think that. Going back to a tooth, right? What's a cavity, really? Well, it's not just kind of like a dark matter, right, or black spot. It's a lack of healthy bone, healthy tooth. It's a lack of that being there. And so you have a natural privation. You're deprived of a healthy tooth. Let's think of a moral evil, right? Let's say someone steals your car. Okay. Now, there's actually a lot of good going on there. A lot of good, if you think about it. The fact that that person knows what a car is, right? They can know what a car is, understand it, and they're able to get into a car and to drive it away. There's a lot of physical good there, right? So where's the evil? Well, common sense sees it right away, but understanding it with our minds, it's actually much more subtle. So the evil is where that person sees the natural law. They see that it's wrong to steal a car, and nevertheless, they disobey what's going on inside their minds, their conscience, and go ahead and use their courage to take it anyway. They act on that knowledge of what is wrong. And so Augustine, it makes sense when Augustine says that evil is really just a disordered love, right? Like maybe he's stealing that car to impress a friend, but his justice, his need for justice towards others in his community, to not steal a car, takes higher precedence. And he knows that, even though it might be fuzzy from, maybe years of stealing cars, who knows, but he still knows that in his heart of hearts. And so this disordered love, putting something that's lower, it's not a bad thing to impress a friend, putting that above what's more important, which is relational justice, right? Okay. All right. So there's also two kinds of evil, okay? So there's the evil we do, which is sin, and the evil we suffer, which is pain, okay? And pain can come through natural things, right? You stubbed your toe. There's a hurricane in Florida. Those happen. And so things happen naturally that will hurt you. Also, others can hurt you, right, through their own sin. And we'll talk about that later. And then also your own sin, the pain you cause, that has effects as well. And so there's two questions that kind of relate to these things, which is, which one is worse, right? A lot of people today say that, physical pain is way worse, sin is inconvenient, or oftentimes leads to a headache or emotional pain, but it's not as bad as, someone getting their arm chopped off or something like that. And so, again, it's important to say that's a real evil, right? But the evil we do is actually worse than what we suffer. And I think that follows from a couple common sense principles, which is that we have free will, right? You could have chosen not to be here today, to not brush your teeth. I'm glad you did both. But you could have chosen those two things, right? And we're finite creatures, right? We're natural beings living in time and space, and we die one day, right? And so it logically follows that, and then also since we can only really make decisions either for or against God, for good or bad, when we're in our bodies, that once you die, that you're locked in place, right? The clock strikes 12 at some point. And so if you can choose for or against God, and we're immortal, which I talked about a lot more in my last lecture, it makes sense that there's a place either for people who choose God or for those who don't, right? And so if there's pain that happens to you, then that's not a pain that you're going to be responsible for, right? No one blames you for when you get diagnosed for cancer. People come to your comfort. But when you commit a sin and when you stay stuck in it, then that could go on for eternity. You have to turn around, kind of reverse the magic spell of it. Okay, so from those two things, immortality and free choice, the evil we do it follows, is actually worse than the evil we suffer. Okay. Okay, so in previous lectures, this all relates together. We have established that there is a God, moral law, and life after death. And it's intuitively obvious that we have free will. So again, those things follow that pain that we cause is actually worse than the pain we suffer. Okay. So it can't be that going to why we're born into the state, right? We're born into a place of suffering, and we have an inclination to sin. And it can't be that all are born without something wrong with them. So Augustine famously talks about in the Confessions with babies that even when babies are breastfeeding, for example, they're going to be fighting each other if there's twins. And he notes this in his Confessions. So there's something wrong even before human beings have a capacity for moral choice, right? It also doesn't make sense to say that, which is, I think, the Muslim position, that each person is unfallen until they choose something for themselves. Because that would mean that free will doesn't really work at all. Because everyone at some point, basically everyone, has chosen at least a venial sin in their life, which is an act of disobedience against God. So there really wouldn't be freedom there. So there has to be something that's passed along that we inherit that causes us to disorder, that causes us towards corruption and then eventually death. So there's a couple pointers that show this to us from a secular perspective. So there's history full of myths, right? And so some people will say that, well, myths kind of show that maybe like the Bible was copied from a Babylonian source. I think it proves the opposite, where imagine that you're in a room with 100 people, and there's a noise, and you all hear this noise, and some of you say it kind of sounds like a dog, some of you like a wolf, and some of you like a fox or something like that. But then one or two people say, I didn't hear anything. Now, it might be a dog, it might be a wolf, it might be something else, but if that's your evidence, it follows that there probably was something made a noise there. And so it's probably true that since you will have all these stories in the ancient literature of a state of original happiness, of holiness, of something like that, and then you have misery later on, that there really was something that happened. Something happened in the garden. Also, we have this deep desire for happiness. You know, if you take care of all your duties for the day and then sit down in your living room, you're by the fire, well, thoughts are going to come of meaning, especially if you haven't considered it before in your life. Why am I here? What am I doing here? What's most important? What do I want to be remembered for? Now, I guarantee you, your dog or your cat, who's right next to you, they're also done for the day. They're not having those thoughts. They're perfectly happy sleeping right there by the fire. And that's fine, because that's what they're made for. They're mortal, right? But we're immortals, and so we live forever, and so we need to know, what is there forever? Is there something that lasts forever? And so we can't help but wonder and not be satisfied. Okay. Now, it's important to make a distinction here between aided versus unaided nature. Okay? So, just you yourself are a material being, right? You're in space and time, and unaided by grace, right when you start, right when you're conceived, you're kind of, as an analogy, driven off the lot and you start deteriorating, right? When you get a new car, you might not see it for a few years, but it's already starting to fall apart, right when you drive it off the lot. And so this is our state, right, as material beings with nerve endings in space and time, facing all sorts of material chaos, right? And it's not a bad thing that there was natural evils before human beings with rational souls existed. right? Because these things are mortals, and they have a different kind of experience of it. So this is where evolution comes in. We'll talk about this later with faith and science. But that's not itself a real evil. It's more of a natural evil. It's not a moral evil. But God created our first parents with an aided nature. And so they were born or created in a state of original holiness or justice, right? So they were made in perfect relationship with God. They have preternatural gifts because of this. They wouldn't die. They wouldn't at least suffer. They might feel pressure from various things as a sort of pain, but they wouldn't suffer as a result of this. So you can kind of think of this as a huge inheritance, right? Our first parents at the windfall, they got $1 billion from God through this aided grace, right? So according to our nature, again, we're material beings. In no way did God owe this to us, but God gave this as a gift, right? But again, they were created like this, so there wasn't evil there in creation. Okay. Okay, so as a Christian philosopher, I would say there was a fall, right? And this makes sense again from the myths, from our desires, from a secular perspective too. So the atheist might object, why should I be punished for something two people did thousands of years ago, right? That doesn't make much sense. If, 1,000 years ago, some person who you were related to, they committed murder or they committed a crime, then you shouldn't be actively punished for that. But it seems like we are actively punished for the sin of Adam and Eve, right? So that's the main objection going on here, I think. And so it's important to realize that we're not actually punished, right? Us today, me and you. Punishment, yes, is associated with a moral personal fault, okay? So he's correct to say that, to point that out. Rather, we suffer the consequences of the thing our first parents did, which was original selfishness, which is maybe more accurate to call original sin. So again, they inherited something great they weren't owed, $1 billion, this original state of grace and holiness with God, relationship with God. But they lit that $1,000, that $1 billion on fire just to do it. And now we are suffering the consequences. There's a knowledge that this existed, right? That itself is a serious pain that we have to deal with. We're kings, like King Lear. We've left the throne, and now we walk around aimlessly. But we knew that our first parents had this kingship, or this queenship. And so that's a consequence, again, that they had this. And so we're limited in our bodies now, and they point towards corruption. But it's important to note that the rich man who gave our first parents $1 billion is not at fault here, right? He gave it to them, and he didn't have to. It was a free gift. Now, they declined it. They said no, and we suffer the consequences for that. But it's not a punishment on us. And I'll talk more about how it relates to our bodies, why this kind of thing can be passed down, and why it relates to our bodies as well, and why it affects everything in creation. But it's certainly not the fault of the rich man that he did that, right? That was generous. And even though they ultimately declined it, it's not his fault. Okay. And so this objection might be pivoted to, well, if God knew that Adam would fall and we'd suffer the consequences, why wouldn't he not create us? And so this is assuming that revelation didn't happen, right? And so, again, this kind of mixes in Christian themes, but I think we can know these things too, or at least by faith. And so it assumes that God can't bring a greater good out of evil, right? And so even though our first parents they were made in the state of original grace and holiness, and they had the garden to tend to. Well, we do know through Revelation that the psalmist says, "Oh, happy fault, that there should have been so great a fall to merit such a great Redeemer." So it is only through God's great goodness and power that he allows these things so that he can bring a greater good out of them. It's not to say they're not real evils, but God can do this, and we've seen this. And also, we wouldn't really be free if he only created us to be perfect, right? Or only knowing if we'd be perfect. So, again, there can't be an illusion of free will or freedom. There has to be the actual possibility to choose the good, right? And they knew what the good was in the garden, and they could have done it clearly, but they didn't. And so it wasn't really an illusion. So again, God wants to make us free, and we can talk about that maybe later during the Q&A, but predestination and grace, they don't contradict. It's more of a both and. So we can talk about that later. And so God's goodness, we'll get back to the body and the soul. So I think oftentimes because of the world we live in the very scientific, analytic world we live in, matter is separated from mind, right? There's two things, your subjectivity and then objectivity, which is outside of you, which is science. And science is good, but this doesn't really quite understand the psychosomatic unity, right? How our bodies and souls interact with each other. And so you can think about this original state that we were in, our first parents were in, kind of like a magnet, right, with spheres, okay? So you can think of God as the magnet, and there's a magnetic field there, or pole. And these spheres are being held up by this magnetic field, which is grace, really. And think of the spheres as the soul, and then going down some more, they're connected to each other, the body, and then nature, okay? So nature, the body, the soul, and then God keeps them all together, right? Now, when we rebel from God, when we get a divorce from God, then that grace is cut off. Not completely, right? We don't think we're utterly deprived or depraved, but we're cut off from sanctifying grace, right, by our own choice. And so these spheres, well, they just bound away. They bounce this way and that way, because without that kind of magnetic field, there's nothing holding them up together, right? And so they're going to go away in various ways. And so that's why we see disorder in nature. That's why we see disorder in our own bodies, right? The physical consequences of being human in a fallen state. And then also in our souls, right? So spiritual disorder, a lack of peace at heart. So these things, they all relate to each other because the body and the soul are more like hand and glove. And in the last talk, I went over how the soul is the form of the body, right? These things are inseparable in our human experience. And so when we're thinking about them, we can't think about them separately, right? It's so important to note that. And when, new generations happen, there's going to be, both a conception to the physical, but also what happens there is a spiritual hegemony or a spiritual inheritance given, because we're not pure matter, right? And so these things relate quite well to each other, or quite like a tapestry or hand in glove. Okay. So in the original objection I mentioned, we talked about God's goodness and God's power. Okay, so I do want to clarify what that means first. So God's goodness is not our being kind or being polite or something like that, right? There's not a grandfather in heaven, there's a father in heaven. And so I think it was Lewis who actually said that many people would have it that God was just some, senile grandfather in heaven. And he just wanted to say at the end of the day that he was glad everyone had a good time. He was glad everyone had a good time. And that's not who God is, really. So God's a father, and he does want what's best for us. But he's the same God who didn't spare his own son, right? In the worst kind of death. And so it makes sense that God would use our suffering, would use suffering in general, which is not morally bad, right? We suffer all sorts of pain and suffering, but it doesn't actually darken us. In fact, it can purify us, right? Like steel in a fire. So God's goodness is not what we think of goodness at first, right? Okay. And then God's omnipotence. So God is all-powerful, right? So what that means for us practically comes down to a couple of things where, could God make a world without pain and sin? Well, yes, he did. That literally existed until it didn't because of us. Did he make a world, or can he make a world without free will? He certainly can. You can think of a smaller scale world, right, as like another planet. Mars, for example, it might have some organic life. It might not. Let's say it does. It has some algae, right? So it has life. And it has all sorts of beautiful rock formations and storms, and it's red, and that's a pretty color. So there's a lot of good things happening on Mars, right? But there's no free choice. There's no humanity on Mars. And so, although we can be kind of lightning rods of suffering, it's been said, if there are aliens, that they wouldn't come here, They wouldn't want to be corrupted by us. They're quarantining us, in other words. But there would be no humanity if there was no free will. And so, in order to have a truly free and a truly proper human race, there would have to be the chance to say no to God. So these two things, they happened. He did create them, a world without sin, and then he, in another way, created a world without free choice, without humanity. But God in his providence said, even though you might misuse it, abuse your free will, he can still bring a greater good out of it. And then, of course, we wouldn't really be human. So those are the two things. Okay. And so I think also in kind of our libertarian spirit, we get lost in, this kind of relates again to how original sin is passed on, that our decisions don't have any effect on other people, except for maybe like our friends and family, but it's limited. And this just isn't true. I mean, personal experience would show this, but when we, for example, when a pregnant mother uses drugs, right, that's going to have a big effect on her child. That child's going to come out addicted to some sort of drug, and positive things too. So like if your grandparents saved for your college fund, well, that's a gift, and that's going to have big consequences as well, in a positive way. And so our actions really have big effects on others, even people we don't know or will know. If one of you guys, hopefully all of you guys, get canonized one day, but you're going to affect some people 600 years down the road in foreign countries if you do get canonized. I mean, John Paul II did that, and he's just been dead now for like 20 years. So it's really important, the impact we can have on others. And it's never really seen, at least not in this life. Okay. And there's also an objection where, why isn't there less suffering? Maybe God exists, but there could be less suffering in the world. Well, the question you have to ask is, how much less suffering? How much of that? Again, people are like lightning rods for suffering, right? We cause our own suffering, and we suffer from others and from natural evils. But is it good that we still exist, right? You can ask that person. If you cut down 50% of the human race, you'll probably have 50% less suffering, roughly. But it's still wrong to kill people, obviously. And even though there's suffering, and sometimes unspeakable amounts of it in people's lives, well, can it be used for good? Can it be turned around and flipped on its head? And experience has shown this. History has shown this. Okay. And just from like a natural perspective, there's practical uses of suffering too, right? It really does help you increase virtue. Courage is one of the hallmark Christian virtues, claiming God's gifts and claiming the human nature that he's given you with all its talents, with all its capabilities. So exercising courage in pursuit of these virtues, well, that eventually gives you them. Because a virtue is just a good habit, something good done over time. Also, in a fallen world, compassion is available. If Adam and Eve didn't fall, then there would be no need for compassion. No one would mess up, right? But in this world, we can have compassion, we can have mercy on people, we can forgive, and that's a big deal. I mean, most people associate God with his mercy, and that's a good thing, right? And so when we show mercy through various ways, that shows God's life in a very unique way. It can also serve as deterrence or just punishment for our personal sins, right? Sometimes we need a good kick in the head or a good slap on the wrist to remember not to do something. Some of us have to learn the hard way. And so it's good that there's discipline, that there's punishment associated with certain acts, right? And there's also solidarity, right? Even though I'm not responsible for, this great evil happening over here, well, I can still offer myself up as someone who protests it or prays for it or stands in the breach and does something about it, right? We're all common humanity. I think we're all something like 40 cousins 3 times removed or something like that at the greatest. So we all have humanity. We all come from the same original parents. And so it makes sense that when you see someone like Jesus, when you see someone like St. John Paul II, that you have some sort of pride in that, especially if you're from Poland, for example, with John Paul. And then also someone like Hitler or Stalin. You have some sort of embarrassment about that person shared in your common humanity. If you found out that Hitler was your grandpa, someone told you this and verified it, you would actually feel some kind of shame. You wouldn't be personally at fault, but there is a responsibility we all have for each other. So we're not like the angels. We do have a shared humanity. Okay. And again, I'm just talking as a philosopher here. So what God would say about this in the Bible is very clear. And there's more to it, but in the Old Testament, the book of Job, right? I recommend the book of Job. And Job is known for his patience, right? But Job is actually the most impatient person in the Bible, arguably. He says, God, I want an answer now. Give me an answer. Why is this happening? If I had a case against God in court, then I would win, right? I'm a just man, and all these bad things are happening to me. But God comes to him. And first of all, he dismisses the friends of Job, who are not really friends, and says, you don't speak of me well, even though they list off pious platitudes I'm sure we all have when someone's suffering. But he acknowledges Job first, that Job is the person who spoke best of him. That's because he spoke honestly. He wanted to know. He had questions. And God's answer is actually a question. God's not the answer man. We're the answer man. He says, Job, were you there when I did XYZ thing? Which means, do you know everything? And clearly not. But Job doesn't directly respond to that. He responds to God's presence. He says, I have seen God, and therefore I am satisfied. So God's presence is his answer. And then in the New Testament, we know that he comes in a much different way, in humanity, fully man, fully God, right? So God's presence is really the answer. And it's important to know. Okay. All right, so now we're going to go on to science and religion, and I'll make sure we have some time for Q&A. So there's an apparent war, look out, between science and religion. okay? So the standard narrative that you probably heard some version of is that 500 years ago, what started was the scientific revolution, and that's true. And science has been rising since then. People's appreciation for science, scientific possibility and strength. We're really known for our science. And Western man and Western woman have a special love and appreciation for science, right? And that's actually true. That's all true. And science is a good thing. And there's also a rise or a decline of religion. There's been a decline of religion in the last 500 years. And I think that's been contested, but I think it's probably true. There's been a general decline in religious practice and religious belief. So that's true as well, right? And then there's another point to this plot where science caused this decline. And I actually think this is partially true, because science has to do with, at least practically, with technology, power and wealth, and making sure these things get out, and you're able to use it in government and otherwise. So I think it's kind of psychologically true. You know, the more power you have over nature, the less you are going to feel like you rely on God, right? So I think it's partly true. But the last claim, which is that science is intellectually a good justification for disbelieving religion, is completely false. And this is what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay. So the question you have to ask someone if they say science contradicts religion, religion contradicts science, is a very specific one, which is some version of, okay, tell me exactly which scientific discovery, at what time, by whom, in what field, contradicted which religious dogma, understood correctly, promulgated by which religion, because some religions are false, at what time, at what place, where. So what exact scientific discovery contradicted what religious dogma, understood correctly in both ways, at what time? Tell me that. And they won't have an answer. They might trot out a few, and I'll go over those few that I think are most relevant. But that's the actual question. Because oftentimes, it's an attitude, right? Of only natural things can be known for sure, or can really prove anything. And that's just an attitude. That's a faith, right? I don't have that much faith. Okay. Again, there has to be a distinction here between bad versus good religion, right? Nostra Aetate, the Vatican II document, found lots of good in various religions, especially the Abrahamic faiths, right? Judaism, Islam. But there's false religion, because religion makes truth claims, right? Some don't. Hinduism is more of a philosophy, so it can't really be falsified by historical events. But things like Islam, Christianity, Judaism, well, they make themselves vulnerable because they make historical truth claims that we can discover, that we can know, or we can at least come to agreement on is true or false, right? So that Jesus claimed he was God, that Jesus rose from the dead. These are historical claims that we can investigate through history, right? And a sound epistemology. And so these are claims that are open to refusal or refuting. So if we can know for certain that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, then we shouldn't be Christians. And so these true religions, or ones that are truer, that have more probability that there really was something divine that happened in them and through them, then they should be investigated. And if they're refuted, then there you go. But if not, then they make truth claims, and so they make claims on us too, about how we should live and if we should follow them and believe them. So religion is not a philosophy, right? And religion is not just an attitude either. Okay. So we'll define our terms again. We went over religion, but what is science, right? So science is the study of the natural world through natural means, okay? And the modern version of science, again, which is good, is comprised of certain things, right? Like the scientific method that you guys know about, universal methodic doubt, right? I doubt these things, therefore I have to test them through active experimentation. Also, there are convergent problems, right? Science wants to find a single solution, a single number, a single method of doing things. It's not really concerned with divergent problems, which is how can I be both free and under God's providence, right? That's not a scientific question. And that goes in different directions, where you can have a both and, two things at the same time. But science converges on one solution, right? X amount of magnesium is required for this reaction. And then just briefly, religion again. So that's our relationship with God. That's what it actually means. And then we've spoken about God already and his power or his omniscience over creation. And so God is revealing himself in religion, okay? It's not just a vague thing with various practices going on. It really is happening in history, and so we can investigate these claims again. Okay. So I'll skip ahead here to various controversies that people will point to or apparent problems. So one of them was the Galileo affair, okay? So that's one that people point to a lot. And they point to it because it really was like the only major battle between science and religion. And so Galileo, but it's usually misunderstood, he was funded by the church, so he was a churchman, and he had a devotion, maybe to St. Francis, but he was a churchman, and I think a practicing Catholic, and he was correct, right, on his heliocentrism. The earth revolves around the sun. But he didn't have much more evidence than Copernicus, right? And so Copernicus was just arguing theoretically that heliocentrism was true. And so Galileo is making arguments for things that he actually doesn't have evidence for. So science is about explanatory power. You know, can your model explain all the things that are happening? And Galileo's couldn't. And he couldn't explain things like the tides. He had no idea how those, he proposed something, but it was pretty obvious it was a bad solution to how tides could work under his system. And other things too. And so what's going on here is that Galileo is making a claim, which turned out to be true, but he didn't have the evidence for it. So you could say, I have a feeling that there's going to be a car accident in this city at this time, in this place. And someone would say, well, why do you really think that? And you're just like, no, I just told you because I have a feeling. And that could be true, right? That could be something from God. Maybe he's prompting you to do something about it. But probably not. That might just be a rationality. And even if you're right, if that does happen, that doesn't mean that you had evidence, just a feeling, right? So he didn't have the evidence, and he was insistent on his claims, right? And he also had a bit of a short temper, and he annoyed a good amount of people. He was put under house arrest, but this is mostly because bishops were being stupid, and bishops can never be stupid, right? Actually, the first bishop who took out a government loan was Judas Iscariot, right? And so they're still doing this to this day and making a mockery sometimes, not always by doing that, but sometimes in their office. So bad bishops, who knew? Another common one is the origin of the universe, the Big Bang. Well, the Big Bang is scientifically proven. It's held as deeply and correctly as any other scientific theory, including heliocentrism. So there was an origin to the universe. You know, even if the atheist wants to say that, you know, all there was infinite matter, and maybe there's another universe that was before all that infinite density, which was like that little packed, basically atom, before it all exploded out in a Big Bang. Well, if you do that, you just kind of kick the can down the road and say, where did that multiverse come from? So there's no real response to this. And then another more niche scientific claim that contradicts it, belief in God apparently, is quantum mechanics or physics. And so quantum just means small, and physics just means matter. So how very small matter works, right? And so it's true that you can call them virtual particles that are so small. They act in strange ways, okay? So they're emerging apparently without cause from an empty vacuum, again, without apparent cause. But this empty vacuum actually has low energy fields, okay? And so these low energy fields churn out matter, but they do so not randomly, as in there's no cause at all, but more of like sometimes on Tuesday it's this matter turned out at this time in this way, versus Thursday it's this time, and then you skip 5 days by analogy on Monday, and the same thing happens. And so what's happening is probabilistic causes, but there's still a cause, right? It's not one-to-one. Every time I drop this, unless there's a miracle, it's going to fall to the ground, right? But with this, it's more of like, if I drop it, sometimes it's going to go over here or this way, but there's still a finite amount of possibilities, and there's still a certain cause, which is my hand dropping it from up here, right? So it's probabilistic, it's not direct, but it's still caused, okay? All right, so here's one of the more popular objections, which is evolution, that evolution disproves theism, or at least Christianity. And so a lot of Protestants will actually accept this, and they'll say that there is a break between religion and science because of evolution, and I choose religion, which is like, if that's the case, then I would be an atheist too, because God's truth can't contradict his truth. This is a whole controversy back in the 13th century when there was an apparent battle between philosophy and religion. And Thomas Aquinas' solution that truth is one, that all truth is God's truth, and that we can show this, and he showed how Aristotle's truths actually make sense or weren't as certain as we think in relation to the Catholic faith. And so truth is one. And so if we look at the Bible, right, Barak, that's the word for creation from nothing, right? So this happens in Genesis 1. God creates from nothing, right? We know by faith, and we can give proofs for this too, or at least some evidence from philosophy. Now, make, which is a different word in Hebrew, this is the word that's used for making man's body. So create from nothing versus make. So making is a kind of formation, right? And the pagans thought everything was just formed, that we had a steady state. But when you're forming something, the Jews thought this could happen too, although that's not how the universe itself was created. But they thought certain things could be made from other things. And so that's what it says in the Bible. So man was made from matter. Which matter was that? Well, it could have been gorillas, apes, kind of a non-rational sort of human, but they wouldn't have had a rational soul. And again, this can't be proved by reason. This can't be proved by the archaeological evidence, right? You can have material bones, but there's no such thing as a soul bone, right? So we do have evidence of human beings from a long time ago, and at some point, they did art or something like that. They kind of showed this abstract possibility or capability, intelligence and free will from within their soul. And so we see our ancestors there. But we don't see the soul itself, right? Because that's gone away after death. Death is the separation of body and soul. And so the atheist or the skeptic can't show that there wasn't a rational soul, right? Just because, at the same time, you can't show that now. There has to be arguments for and against it, not just because of mere matter, which is the bones they find. So it doesn't show either way. And again, so things from the Bible like 6 days, well, there couldn't have been 24 hours literally, right? Because the sun wasn't there until day 4, right? So clearly something else is being used here. And so the Bible is a document in Genesis, we'll talk about specifically. It's a document that has historical truths, right? There really was a fall. There really was first parents. This is what is being gotten at. And you can't disprove this by science or the historical apparatus. But it's not literal, right? Because there's certain literary devices that we're not used to, that someone like an ancient Hebrew author would use. And so these are being deployed, right, for various reasons, to go back against the pagans. At that time, it was just the Jews against everyone else, monotheism versus polytheism. And so they're using devices that show the unique creative character of God, right, and his power and his grasp over all of time and space. And so days, they're using that in a literary way, but that doesn't mean it's not historically true. Okay. One last thing about science and religion. There's sort of a artificial intelligence or mind-body problem, which is talking about a lot today. And so the question that the atheist is going to ask is there anything you can't explain with just matter, right? Go for the simplest solution. If you can explain everything with just material, then why not do that? That's what they say. And so it's true that, during a mystical experience, there's a certain part of the brain that doesn't light up when it typically should at some sort of sense data that's coming in. So there's something there, right? And I spoke about this last time a little bit. There's some correlation. But, and again, so I talked about that. You would have to say that this faith in everything being matter, you could totally flip it on its head and say that validly, you could argue that everything is immaterial, that there is no matter. This is what Buddhists believe, basically. And any matter that is pointed to, any matter understood, is going to be a mental act, right? Because your mind grasps things that are material. And so you could say because what's being grasped is being grasped in the mind, that everything is just immaterial. So it works both ways. And if you're not convinced by that, and you guys aren't Buddhists, so I don't think you are, then you can't say that matter explains everything either, right? So it's not a very strong proof. And then also, it makes sense. You ask any psychologist, the psychosomatic unity is very present, very real. And so it makes sense that anything that affects your soul, that affects your mind, that affects your will, is going to affect your body in some way, right? And so, again, I talked about these things last time with the soul, but just to remind you guys. Okay. All right, before we do questions, just a couple other things that are problematic today. One of them is nominalism. So very quickly, this is the idea that there are no universals. There are just individual things, okay? There's just subjective individuals. And this is really stupid, but it had a lot of effects on people. Martin Luther, right, the person who started the Protestant Reformation, said, "I am nothing if not an Occamist." And William of Ockham was the one who came up with this, or started to push it out into academia. So again, ideas have consequences. And you can refute this by saying, well, is that statement a universal fact, that there are no universals? And is language, which is required to say something like that, also not a universal? And if they say that, then they contradicted themselves. And this philosophy is also anti-common sense. If I told you that a tree and a bush and a squirrel were, well, let's say an ox, were right next to each other, and I would say that there's nothing different about these three things than their names, right? If I said that, you would rightly find me ridiculous. The two things that I mentioned first, the tree and the bush, well, those things are obviously much more related than the ox in terms of their powers, in terms of what they look like, all these things. So it's intuitively a bad position. And then quickly, skepticism, which is basically that truth is unknowable, first pushed a lot by David Hume, the Scottish philosopher. This is immediately self-contradictory again, because you're saying that truth, that no truth is knowable, that you can know that. And if they respond, that's just a probability, well, you have to go back. Is that you being probably sure that truth is unknowable, is that also a probability? Because you can't say that, well, this is probable, and the only way to know something is by probability, and then that fact is itself knowledgeable, or you can know that for certain. So it's an infinite regress. And if you have too many probabilities, well, eventually you'll go wrong. You can't hit the lottery forever. So that's a problem there. Okay, that's about it. So we'll do questions. I think I went over a little bit of time, maybe 5 minutes for questions. You have to go. Please feel free to. But thank you guys for listening. So, yes. Okay.
It's the home of the National Association of Catholic Chaplains. And that particular time, they invited chaplains of all faiths to come, ministers, priests, nuns, lay people like myself. And I wanted to go because Henry Nouwen, the famed author, famed priest, who taught at Yale, and he taught at Yale, he had standing room only with his classes on religion. And I had read all of his books, so it was important to me to be there. I was so excited to see him. But one question he asked, again, 500 people here in this big conference center, how many are happy in their faith? And every hand, or not happy in their faith, and every hand rose. And I think the point stayed with me is we all have certain questions on things, but it's the acceptance of how it's presented and where God is working within us.
Beautiful, yeah. Yeah, I think there was a professor and a Jesuit at BC who predated me, but they still have an institute in his honor. His name was Bernard Lonergan, Father Bernard, and he said that everyone wants to know everything about everything, right? And so that's a good thing. We have this itch that we have to scratch in our minds, but also to keep in mind that we don't just try to know these things on our own and for no purpose, that they're ultimately for a purpose, right? If you open your mouth all the time, you're open-minded. Well, eventually that has to close on food, right? Your mind, your mouth has to close on something that's true, right? It's the purpose of eating. It's the purpose of discovering and investigating what is true. But if you don't close your mouth, then flies will gather and you won't eat anything and you'll starve. And so, yeah, the importance of, doing it in relationship with God, that I can't stress the importance of that enough. And finally, coming to conclusions, right? And knowing that, even if some arguments I gave or you've heard from anyone, they don't quite sound right or something like that, taking that in prayer and then assenting in faith that, maybe I don't see it right now and I don't always see it either, but knowing that, there's some good evidence here, even though maybe something's off about how I'm understanding this, and I can trust God, right? I can trust God. I know who He is. And so that's very important. So thank you for that. Yeah. There's a lot going on here. I wish I had more time. Yeah. Problem of evil.
I have time, a couple of questions. I had this, some time ago, heard this conversation between a Christian and an atheist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the atheist asked what I thought was a very interesting question, which was, if God is all-knowing, why would He allow or create people that are evil, that He knows are evil, and will create, and won't be safe, and will suffer through life tremendously? So it's kind of a, I don't know, tangential to your first point of the problem of evil.
Yeah.
So I was wondering your thoughts on why does God allow that?
Yeah. It's so important. And the distinction that has to be made here is ontological evil versus moral evil, right? Because everything that exists is in some way good, right? We know God, well, I'll explain it like this. This podium, right? It's good, right? It's good that it exists, and it's serving a good purpose right now. It's serving its end for people to speak over it, but it's limited severely, right? So it doesn't have a mind. It doesn't have a body. It doesn't have will, right? We can know these things for certain. And so it's very limited with its essence, right? Its nature. Now, I'm also limited, right? I'm a material body. I have nerve endings. I have certain lacks, right? I have certain faults, but I also have a lot of good about me, right? Including my powers, right? Which are there whether I use them well or not. And so my essence is limited, but also greater than this table, right? And so a part of the human essence would be free will, right? You don't, if you're a Coke machine, or if you go to a vending machine and you press the button for a Coke, you pay the money, and it doesn't give you what you wanted, you usually kick it or say something maybe you regret saying later, but you never tell the Coke machine to go to confession, right? That's because it's not a part of their natures. But it's a part of ours to choose good or evil, right? And so with that, we're not ontologically bad, but some of us, as a proper accident to our souls, as a sort of state or disposition, how we go about, some of us decide to live in a state of evil or in a state of lack, apart from God. Now, he might be getting more at, why does this happen? Why is it given to us? And again, it's so key to emphasize that this is not a punishment for what you did or for what I did, right? We're not directly responsible for what Adam and Eve did and for what our first parents did, right? But we suffer the consequences, again, because that's part of our human nature to wreak havoc on other people as social animals, or to wreak all sorts of goodness on other people, like the saints did, right? And so it's the state of being a human being. We're not vertical 100% like the angels are, right? They choose yes or no. They don't affect other angels. They're all different species. But we're the same species, right? Everything we do affects everyone else. And so there was this $1 billion that was given at the very beginning. God created them good, ontologically, as natural beings, but then gave them this extra $1 billion, grace and life with him. And then Adam declined it, right? He lit it on fire. And so we suffer the consequences, but we're not being punished. And I think this is where faith comes in, where you see God bringing a greater good out of it, right? He doesn't leave us orphans, and instead of just, we would be with him, obviously, but instead of just life in the garden, right, where there's lots of pleasures and various things, we can now be divinized, right? We can participate in the divine nature. And so, oh, happy fault kind of thing. But again, this happens in relationship, and it's never psychologically easy, especially for people who, again, are like divorcees from God. So, there you go.
Different one on science.
Mm-hmm.
Because you mentioned the Big Bang Theory.
Yes.
One of the theories within the theory is that when the Big Bang occurred, not only one universe was created, but an infinite number of universes were created.
Yeah, I don't think this is true. I think there's actually borders. There's a frame in the picture. So space is not infinite. I think that's a...
So that's the theory, right? There is a theory that I can't remember exactly where it came from, but when recently they got the Higgs boson
Yeah.
mass, so the Higgs boson mass landed in a place that didn't answer
Mhm.
a single universe versus not only multiple but infinite number of universes. But my question was, if we had this is a very hypothetical question, right? If we had proof of scientifically either an infinite universe
Yeah.
or a multi-infinite multi-universe, would that change our perception of how God created the universe, right? Because it wouldn't be highly improbable that we are a random set of events. It will actually be a certainty that we are a random set of events. And I had this conversation with my wife the other day, because she was, I'm just wondering about this weird stuff,
No,
And I mean, at the end of the day, for me, it would not make much of a difference from a faith perspective. But it's not proof. It's hypothetical. Maybe it will never be proof.
yeah.
But I'm wondering if you could bring on it.
Yeah.
it's good to wonder about these things. Yeah, I think it's at least disputed, right? I think it actually is more certain that there is borders to the universe, right? But even if so Thomas Aquinas, he actually rejected, this argument was around when Thomas Aquinas was writing. It was first proposed by Al-Ghazali, who was a Muslim philosopher, that there was a start of the universe, therefore there must have been a starter of the universe, which is God. So something like that. And he actually thought you couldn't know this with reason. He thought you couldn't know with reason. He thought you could only have it by divine faith. He didn't think there was affirmative proof of it, but he didn't think that creation from nothing and the start of the universe could be known with reason. But Aquinas, again, in the reasons we went over in the first seminar, he still thinks you can prove God exists through many other things. And his first proof, which is his favorite and most certain, has to do with motion here and now. So like me moving these flashcards, he thinks you could prove God just by doing that. And we went over that before. So for Aquinas, it's not as, it's more of a matter of faith. And I don't think they could prove it, because if you could prove something infinitely, like proving a negative, a universal negative, is much more difficult to do, right? Like if you were to say, well, I can prove that there are no black swans, right? And if you said that in the 19th century, then people would say that's probably true, but you haven't been to all the places on Earth, and people haven't. And in fact, in the, I think, early 20th century, they found black swans. That's why you hear about it today, a black swan event, an extremely rare thing. That's what that is, right? So it's hard to prove universal negatives, and so it's hard to prove that there couldn't be a lack of space and time somewhere, right? In the same way. And there's, sorry, something else I wanted to say, but I'm forgetting now. But it's very, I suppose it's possible, because like God created, I think you can hold a different position on this, but it was like semi-eternal, the angels, right? Because they are not material, right? And so they don't actually, they are created, but they aren't actually created in space and time. It's kind of hard to wrap your head around. But maybe something like that. But sorry, I don't think I answered your question fully, but those are a couple thoughts on it.
Who knows if that would ever come true, right? But it's an interesting sort of thought to ponder.
Definitely interesting to think about. Yeah.
So as a Catholic, you say that. So before Adam and Eve exercised their free will and chose to go against God and to sin, wasn't there Satan, or Lucifer, who was a fallen archangel? Wasn't he like the first to reject God and then tempted? So like if we're going to make like a hierarchy, it's like Satan, the archangel, went against God, then tempted Adam and Eve, and he as an archangel is more powerful than humans, because angels and archangels. So there's like not that we're blaming anyone, but I'm trying to understand how Satan wasn't the first to choose evil against and
Good question.
God.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And then another thing I want to say is I am happy with my health.
Beautiful. Yeah. Wonderful.
So
yeah.
Well, you didn't mention, you've been talking about Adam and Eve, but I kept thinking, well, where's Satan in this picture?
Yes.
In this discussion.
Yeah.
Because in my world, he exists.
Absolutely. Yeah, I fully believe in angels and demons. If there aren't any demons, then all we need is trimming around the edges, right? There's really no spiritual warfare and no battle. And we didn't really need a savior then, right? So it's all related. It's all a package deal. And you're completely right. There was a time before time right? It's kind of hard to think about or wrap your head around, for me too. But there was a moment, you could say, where the angels got a choice, right? They knew God gave them enough knowledge of who he was, what he was, and there was a choice made, right? And so by the fact that those angels don't have bodies, right, they are not acting in space and time. That's what it means to be in space and time, right? We're covered in matter too. We're in the enclosed universe. They made a decision eternally, right? And so this decision, I suppose it's possible God could have, but it'd be against his wisdom to, and somehow change their decision. When they've made a choice with so much knowledge, these are purely intelligent beings. They're much smarter than us, both the bad ones and the good ones, these angels. And so they had enough knowledge to make a choice, right? And so God respects their free choice, just like with us, but in a more one definitive act, okay? And so, Satan fell before the world begins, and we know this because he would have been there, right? And you can think about it like any, and he would have been there, but just like analogously. First of all, he might have been embodied or influencing matter in some way, and how fallen angels and good angels influence is that they're not there physically. They're not like semi-material or airy spirits. They have influence in certain places, right? So where great evil was done, for example, the Holocaust, demons would have more influence there over our thoughts, over our minds. They would be able to push us more towards bad things. Versus a good place, like this church, angels would be more present here, right? And that just means good influences. And they're real beings, but they influence us in our thoughts, minds, desires, feelings. And so those would be more and more moved towards God, right? And so that's how kind of they work. And and then they would have influenced Adam and Eve by giving them falsities and in some way. And so that's kind of why God, in the famous parable of the Good Samaritan, when the man who is us is on the side of the street, robbed and half dead, he was robbed by someone and destroyed on his way to Jericho. He would have been analogously destroyed by Satan, right? The father of lies. But God, who picks up the lowly, that's how he works, brings us back to an inn and then pays for our stay there in the parable. So, I don't know if that was, did that answer your question?
Well, it's not so much a question, it's just, so evil had to exist prior to Adam and Eve when,
Yes.
correct me if I'm wrong, which is what I'm hoping you do, because Satan, who was manifested as the serpent, was already the fallen angel, so he was able to tempt Adam.
Yes, there was evil, and there was death before the fall. And we know this because God literally tells Adam and Eve to eat the fruit and when you, and to use the earth. And so they would have been eating plants, right? And so when you eat a plant, that destroys it, right? And so there's death there. So there's death in nature, but there's not death for human beings, for rational souls, before the fall. And so it's explicitly stated in Genesis that as a result of the fall, you will see death. And so there was death before that, and that kind of makes sense because God works over time and through secondary causes, and from little humble beginnings to great ends. And so it makes sense, evolution, which is just starting from the very bare bottom, right? Just, really like pointless matter. But then you have basically multiple Big Bangs where you have organic life from non-organic life. Scientists can't explain that. That's a miracle. They've been trying to replicate it, and they can't do that. I think with like cloning, that's just like replicating what's already there. But they can't make living organisms or matter from non-living matter. So there's a sort of miracle that takes place there, and it goes up and up and up until we have
beings, embodied beings, with minds and with free wills. And so those kind of beings, they were given that special $1 billion that I've talked about. But we, said no for some reason. But yeah, there was certainly death, there was certainly rebellion, and there was a journeying to the present state of the world, or at least 15,000 years ago or wherever, when Adam and Eve, our first parents, popped up. So yeah, that doesn't contradict God's goodness again, because things like animals who might have tasted death before the fall, they don't experience things in the same way we do, right? 90% of pain is mental, and they don't experience things as an I. It's more of like pain is happening here when an animal gets injured. It's not like I'm in pain, I'm suffering, how could this be happening? All these existential things. It's more of just pain. There's pain. No I in there, no subject. So yeah, that doesn't contradict God's goodness, that he would allow that. Yeah, thank you. Okay, it's a bit over, but thank you guys for your time. I'll stick around if you have any more questions. So God bless you. We'll be back next week for the conclusion of this little series on faith and reason, or how our Catholic faith relates to philosophy and what we've been talking about. So it should be fun. I'm excited for that one. It'll be more of a narrative or a story. So everyone likes stories more. So thank you.